Militant empathy. Hey, it's me, your gal, Militant Empathy, back again to fill you up with every single thought that has ever crossed my mind. So before we get started, I wanted to kick off with a little personal anecdote. So I was at a party the other week, and me and my friends were doing one of my favorite party games, the one where we all drunkenly give elaborate toasts about how much we love each other and the specific reasons why. I'm sure you all know this very popular and definitely real party game. I recommend it in the strongest terms, dear listener. But anyway, we were doing our round of toasts when it got to me, and one of the guys at the party said that he thought I was very quote unquote mysterious, which to me was extremely surprising because I've never had an unexpressed thought in my goddamn life. This podcast being exhibits A through Z. Is this opening anecdote just a way for me to flex that I've finally achieved my lifelong goal of shutting up for long enough to convince a heterosexual man that I am actually mysterious? Yes. Absolutely. And yes, I am strongly considering emailing my old therapist and just being like, hey, Steve, we finally fucking did it. But it is also an anecdote through which to tie in the latest trend in TikTok vernacular because at the time of writing, this is August 2024, not sure exactly when this episode will air or when it will reach your sweet ears, but at the time of writing, the internet is being absolutely bombarded by calls to be very demure, very mindful. This latest trend has been mostly linked to icon and TikToker Jules LeBron. Now, LeBron is a trans woman, and she first really came on the global scene on August 2nd, 2024, when she posted 2 videos advising her followers on first, how to prevent makeup from caking into a white mustache if you are a, quote, sweaty girl, and second, how to be, quote, demure at work. It was this second video on how to be demure that rocketed LeBron to viral fame, racking up over 6 million views in just a few days, with the catchphrase quickly being snapped up by everyone from Jennifer Lopez to the New York Department of Sanitation, and most recently at time of writing, by the White House. LeBron has since released a series of further videos, ironically advising viewers in how to be demure in an increasingly absurd array of scenarios. From picking up your ID that you drunkenly left in the gay bar the night before, the advice here is to not stay for any further drinks, but to go straight home, very demure, very mindful. To going to the Las Vegas Strip. Here we must flat iron our wig, do a little braid, make sure our nails are not too long, not too short, cut a little slit in your top, show a little chi-chi, but not too much. Very demure, very mindful, very cutesy. The tongue-in-cheek genius of LeBron's comedy could not be more obvious than in a series of clips she calls Blinkerton, the series, which are kind of riff on the traditional Get Ready With Me makeup vlog, but with the added twist that in between each stage of the makeup, LeBron will hit a blinker. Now, for my fellow geriatrics, a blinker refers to when you inhale so forcefully on a vape pen, presumably going off the volume of coughing, in this case it is a weed vape pen, that the warning light blinks and the inhalation is cut off. It is precisely this juxtaposition of a trans woman, someone who is generally excluded from conservative ideals of femininity, applying like a full face of makeup. It's not that kind of makeup look that's designed to look, completely invisible. There's high coverage foundation, pronounced eyeliner, etc., hitting essentially the electronic version of a blunt, coughing her lungs up continuously throughout the video and reminding the divas to stay demure, stay mindful, that is nothing short of genius. Julian Glover, an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies and dance, and choreography at Virginia Commonwealth University, has emphasized that the term demure has long been popular in the queer ballroom scene, and LeBron herself credits the many demure divas that came before her, including Venus Extravaganza, a star of the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning. But in that context, the term had, in Glover's words, very clear connections with the politics of passing and would, quote, always be used in reference to someone who wants to articulate a feminine embodiment, and that feminine connotation reflects the white Western way of understanding the world. What LeBron is here doing is kind of the inverse. She's not truly holding up demure as a literal ideal. Instead, she is turning the politics of passing on its head. What makes LeBron's commentary on what she calls demurité funny is precisely the fact that she is neither the kind of woman that would traditionally be considered demure, i.e. she is not somebody who perfectly performs a modest, white, feminine ideal that is reserved, elegant, in her words, not doing too much, nor is she describing behavior that is in fact demure. Because of this, she succeeds in making the whole notion of the demure feminine completely absurd, and in doing so throws into sharp relief the wider fact that gender itself is a kind of absurdist performance. So why do I bring this up? Apart from the fact that I'm chronically online and have whatever brain type it is where you have to relate everything back to the latest internet phenomenon, I bring it up because I want to talk about sex. Specifically, I want to talk about women and sex and women's sexuality. Now, not to give too much away here, but one of the overarching points I'm going to make in this episode is that women's sexuality has, since biblical times, been categorized on a binary, where there are, on the one hand, the demure divas, and on the other hand, the shameless skanks. The world has long been split into the Madonnas and the whores, the wives and the concubines, the sacred and the profane. And today we're going to unpack all that and more. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. First off, I will be using the term whore frequently throughout this episode, and that is because I am referencing the Freudian Madonna-Whore complex. More on that in a minute. I'm not going to use the term to refer to literal sex work or sex workers, and unless you are one, you shouldn't either. In terms of the themes of this episode, most obviously we're going to talk about racism, misogynoir, slut-shaming, and the sexual exploitation of women, and kind of the patriarchy writ large. If that's not the vibe for you today, please feel free to switch over now to one of the other episodes. I can't promise you that it will contain any lighter themes, but maybe just ones that feel a bit more correct for you. As a reminder, you can find all the episodes on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. Right, now that that's the housekeeping out the way, let's get down to it. So, where to start on the subject of sex? Well, naturally, we're going to start with the fluids. Where else, honey? Okay, I'm being semi-ironic here. We are genuinely going to start with a discussion of fluids, but sadly not the kind that you're thinking of. Instead, we're going to start with a discussion of the medical theory of humorism, which covers the fluids of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Yes, just as good. So humoral theory was a theory about how the basic functioning of the human body worked. It was set out by a guy you might have heard of called Hippocrates, also known for such bangers as the Hippocratic Oath, i.e. the basic professional standards that all physicians to this day still swear to, that is, to heal the sick and do no harm. Anyway, around 460 BCE, Hippocrates theorizes that the basic functioning of the human body and its ability to fend off disease was dictated by the balance of these four kinds of core liquids contained in the body, which he referred to as humors. So humoral theory is why you have physicians doing shit that seems like demonstrably mental, although again, I'm not a medical professional, like applying leeches. It's actually kind of troubling how often I have to say that per episode. Maybe I should stay in my lane a little bit. But anyway, the thinking behind applying leeches to cure disease is inspired by this humoral theory because it was thought that by removing some of the blood in the body, you would rebalance the humors and cure the ailment. A couple of centuries later, another Greek physician called Galen comes along, this time in the year 200 AD, and makes some critical additions to Hippocrates' humoral theory because he argues that each of these liquids, or humors, has its own distinctive characteristics. So he thinks that the four humors can be linked to the four natural elements: fire, earth, water, and air. So each humor has the characteristic of being either hot, dry, wet, or cold, which all sounds like very horoscopy, very tarot cards, very co-star app vibes to me. So naturally, I love it, and I believe in it wholeheartedly for no reason at all. But maybe other listeners would have some questions about the soundness of this medical theorizing, and they in fact would be correct. Tarot cards on the table here, guys. This is a bit of an oversimplification of Galen's contribution. He also identified a number of other humors, but in the interest of keeping this episode actually about sex and not an endless array of bodily fluids, we'll just stick with the core four. Anyway, Galen's addition is crucial because it extends the significance of humoral theory from the purely physiological, i.e., the balance of certain liquids being the key to good physical health, to the psychological. He essentially argues that the unique ratios of each of these liquids in each individual dictates not only their physical health, but also their behavior and temperament. And this is where we get firmly into the realm of medical misogyny, right? Because when we get right from the medieval period all the way to the early modern era, so from like 476 AD up to the end of the 1600s, and yes, I know some people think the early modern era ends in the 1800s, but I disagree with those people, so moving on. Anyway, all throughout that period, physicians are still learning from and adapting Galen's theory, which, quick sidebar, let's just note how fucking mental that is, that the font of medical knowledge for these physicians remained largely unchanged for some 12 to 1400 years. Absolutely bananas. Where is the rigorous peer review process in this? Where is the ruthless and never-ending quest for funding now? Anyway, so when these dumb fucks were reading Galen, they at some point surmised that the perceived behavioral differences between men and women resulted from the fact that women had both less and a worse quality of those liquids that ran hot and dry, these being blood and yellow bile, and instead had a surplus of those humors that ran cold and wet, i.e. black bile and phlegm. So, for example, medieval physicians thought that menstrual blood and male semen were both just different kinds of blood, right? So they think that semen is white because it had been purified and refined by the impeccable machinery of the male body, whereas menstrual blood was seen as this like impure excess that the female body rid itself of monthly, because it physically, couldn't purify the blood as efficiently as males. I promise we really will start talking about sex soon. But yes, this is one of the reasons why it was thought that women had a higher natural urge for sex, precisely because they wanted to suck up all that delicious heat, energy, and purity from the male body. Maybe unsurprisingly, given that it was the literal Dark Ages and the ability to read was seen as inherently suspicious, these exclusively male physicians had no pseudo-biological explanations for why women might desire other women. I guess they were just fucking crazy or something. But this is our kind of starting point for the pathologization of female sexuality, the centuries-old notion that women are biologically essentially cold, wet, sex-crazed harlots. One thing to point out here is that this notion that women have much higher sex drives probably seems quite counterintuitive to us today, since we're more used to hearing nowadays that it is men who are plagued by this unstoppable craving for sex. Although somehow the men have managed to gain this coveted reputation without being subject to any discussion of black or yellow bile, which seems grossly unfair. And I think the reason that this notion that all women crave sex, indeed more so than men, seems so alien to us is precisely because of the success of what I'm going to talk about next. And that is the creation of the sexual binary for women, the construction of the Madonna and the whore. So, I'm not an anthropologist or some kind of evolutionary psychologist, two disciplines that I think tend to make grand statements about long-term trends in human nature more often. By training, I am a historian, and we're the discipline that likes to go, hey, those two things that you think are the same, they're actually very different because of some probably very minor contextual historical detail you've forgotten to consider, you fucking idiot. But I'm going to give it a stab now. So, since at least biblical times, and don't come to me in the comments because I haven't bothered to look up all the way back to like the Big Bang, it seemed like biblical times was like a fine starting point, okay guys? But anyway, yeah, since at least biblical times, human societies of the Abrahamic persuasion, so that's the ones that share the teachings of the Old Testament, being Judaism, Islam, and later Christianity, were pretty fucking suspicious of women. And we know this because they incorporated their suspicion of women into their creation myths. So we're all probably familiar with some version of the story of Adam and Eve, right? In the book of Genesis, it is written that the first man, who was named Adam, was made by God from the soil of the earth, and the first woman, named Eve, was made by God in order to be his companion and was made from the rib of Adam. Story goes that Adam and Eve are living very happily in the Garden of Eden until Eve, that stupid fucking bitch, does the one thing she's not supposed to do and eats the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because some snake told her to. And this causes the downfall of man, and for Adam and Eve to be forever cast out of the Garden of Heavenly Delights. Now, This is really the kindergarten version of that story that the snake, slithers along and whispers some words of temptations into Eve's ear, persuading her to eat the forbidden fruit because she's a big, gullible dum-dum. Elsewhere in the Bible, however, specifically in the book of Numbers and the book of Leviticus, yes, we are going to be talking about scripture now, but elsewhere in the Bible, it is implied that after the snake watched Adam and Eve make love, he develops a desire for the first woman and mates with her, tainting her and all her subsequent offspring with his filth. So the contamination of humanity comes not only from the eating of the forbidden fruit, but also from literally fucking the snake. The downfall of the human race is born literally out of the sexuality of the woman. Additionally, within the Jewish Bible, in the book of Genesis, it is suggested that Eve had, as one scholar put it, a quote, overdeveloped sex drive and was, quote, constantly enticing Adam. So this is pretty far from the heavily sanitized version of Eve that we all know and love. Eve is never portrayed as the good guy, given that she's made responsible for the downfall of humanity, but she's at least portrayed as a woman who's sins because she's too stupid and or too weak to resist temptation, rather than this sex crazed demon who has a compulsive urge to sin. So how did we get from biblical Eve to kindergarten Eve? Well, here is where Lilith comes in. So within the Judeo-Christian tradition, Lilith is often described as Adam's first wife. However, her lore originates from far older myths and legends spanning several millennia, where she was also alternately described as the mother of demons, the lover of Satan, a seductress of men, and a destroyer of life, particularly those of young children and pregnant women, and sometimes is confusingly also described as a fertility goddess. Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated. So what we need to understand first is that the Bible is not one book, right? Not to be massively blasphemous, but it's not just one guy banged it out in a single sitting and that was the definitive word of God. Instead, what we know today as the Bible is actually the amalgamation of different religious texts, often inspired by myths and legends from pre-existing religious traditions that were cherry-picked to describe the new morality set out in this religious tradition. And this cherry picking was done by various communities of authors spanning several languages, editions, and centuries. This means that there is a lot of stuff in the Bible that is contradictory, including not one, but two creation myths in the book of Genesis. So the one we're most familiar with is actually the second creation myth, where God creates the world in 7 days. First he creates Adam, and later he creates Eve from his rib, yada, yada, yada. The first creation myth in the book of Genesis says that God creates the world in 1 day, and he creates the first man and the first woman at the same time from the same soil of the earth. This is the creation myth that will later be associated with Lilith. Although confusingly, the book of Genesis does not name her as Lilith. The only place Lilith is mentioned in the Bible is in the book of Isaiah, but that's a whole other thing, and we're not even going to get into that here. So another point that we need to understand about biblical history is that even after the Bible is written, religious leaders from the Abrahamic religions continue to add to its lore as part of their studies. They're basically seeking to explain what the Bible means to their communities. And part of that means, trying to explain the contradictions that are in the Bible, why are there two separate creation myths? Within Jewish studies, it is suggested that both creation myths are true, and the first one relates to Adam's first wife, who is named Lilith. Where we get the most details on Lilith is in a medieval text called the Alphabet of Ben Sirach, which is thought to have been written sometime between the 8th and 11th century AD. In it, Lilith is described as the haughty first wife of Adam, who abandons him after he rejects her demands to be treated with equality since, after all, in Lilith's logic, they were both created equal from the same soil on the same day. And when God sends angels to retrieve her and bring her back to Adam, she refuses to return and instead opts to sacrifice 100 of her demon babies every day in order to remain with her lover, who may well be Satan himself. In revenge for her lost demon babies, Lilith also vows to a life of killing human children and the unborn, to the extent that women who follow more mystical strands of Judaism will still wear amulets to ward off Lilith whilst pregnant. Not the version of the Bible you were probably taught in primary school. Now, what then is the function of Lilith within Jewish mythology? Well, I think it's twofold. Firstly, and most obviously, Lilith operates as a kind of warning to men about the dangers of independent and sexually aggressive women. It's pretty heavily implied that having a wife who will not subordinate herself to your will is extremely undesirable and might lead to, the downfall of society and the death of your children. Secondly, though, and perhaps less obviously, Lilith is a narrative device which serves to rehabilitate Eve. So we have to consider the chronology of all of this. Lilith was artificially inserted into Judeo-Christian mythology almost a millennia after the original book of Genesis was written. Why did this happen? Well, Polish academic of applied psychology and religious studies, Wojciech Kosior, has argued that this was essentially to create a dark mirror image of Eve, who, whilst extensively denigrated in the Bible, ascribed with numerous sins already detailed, is also ascribed with some, positive characteristics, such as being like the mother of all life, whereas Lilith is only the mother of demons. Essentially, the myth-making around Lilith helps to rehabilitate the image of Eve by comparison. Precisely because Lilith is characterized as pure darkness, Eve appears lighter in contrast. This is the basic pattern that patriarchal societies will continue to follow vis-a-vis women's sexuality up to the present day. One woman or one class of women are cast down so that another woman or class of women may be elevated by comparison. In this sense, the tales of Lilith and Eve is the creation of the Madonna-Whore binary. So, the term Madonna-Whore is most closely associated with 19th century granddaddy of psychoanalysis and cocaine addict Sigmund Freud, who coined the term Madonna-Whore complex to refer to the loss of sexual attraction some men experience when they enter into serious monogamous relationships with a woman. Freud theorized that due to developmental issues often thought to be an overbearing mother, because why would this not all somehow be a woman's fault? Some men struggle to view women as full independent beings and so must categorize them into either the Madonna or the whore. Crucially, both the figures of the Madonna and the whore are objectified, meaning that they're a kind of caricature. They are symbols, they're not full people, but they are objectified in diametrically opposing ways. As one Redditor put it in an excellent response on the subreddit Explain Like I'm 5, and yes, I do still do the book learning, but this is a really good summary and we don't need to be overly pretentious about everything. Quote, Madonna refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus. Women who fit into this category are loved as holy art. They are objectified to be above and beyond. They are the focus of devotional love and obsession, primarily focused on their purity. However, a man who is in love with a woman who they categorize as Madonna will be unable to feel sexual attraction towards her, or if he does, he will feel disgusted at himself. The purity and the holiness that he identifies with the woman will either keep him from being attracted to her or make him feel like he has violated a holy, sacred object if he feels sexual desire towards her. Whore, of course, refers to a woman who is used purely for sexual desire. A woman who fits into this category could never be the focus of the man's love. He will lust after her, but he would be willing to insult and degrade her all the same. She lacks the holy nature of the Madonna. She is solely the focus of the man's darker lusts. End quote. Now, whilst Freud was interested in looking at individual sexual dysfunction, I think his theorizing has broader societal implications. There is also a trend, I'm going to argue, within wider society of elevating via restrictive, desexualized objectification the status of certain women, whilst at the same time denigrating the status of other women via dehumanization and hypersexual objectification. Ultimately, neither class of woman truly wins, because neither is genuinely free to be a whole multifaceted person. But we cannot escape the fact that the elevated status of the Madonna is dependent on the denigrated status of the whore. The through line from Lilith to the demonization of female sexuality in the early modern period is extremely direct, and it goes by way of the witch hunts. I think we often forget nowadays that a lot of Christian and other religious beliefs have these like very strong mystical elements to them because, generally the language of mainstream religion has now pivoted to embrace more of the rationalism associated with the scientific revolution. So, for example, whilst things like homosexuality may be portrayed as, sinful, and even in some more extreme cases as the work of the devil, gay people are not typically portrayed as like literal demons or warlocks or some other sort of magical being, which I think we would all agree is a great loss to the culture. Bigots today just don't have the same flair for the supernatural as medieval bigots. The storylines could be workshopped a bit more. But yeah, this was not the case for a lot of human history, wherein the mystical element had not yet been purged from mainstream religion, so the moralistic demands of those religions were still expressed in very fantastical ways. The European witch hunts are a key example of this. So, witch hunts, which was, the ritualistic purging by a public trial and execution from society of people accused of witchcraft, were a fairly common occurrence throughout Western Europe in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, but they really peaked during a 70-year period between 1560 and 1630. The fact that the witch hunts mostly targeted women is fairly common knowledge. So, in total, around 60,000 people were thought to have been killed during the peak of the European witch hunts, and around 85% of those were thought to have been women, with women also making up 80% of all those accused, whether executed or not. What is perhaps less commonly understood or appreciated is that the witch hunts were essentially a sexual persecution of women, wherein the crimes they were accused of were deeply sexualized, and what was on trial was women's sexuality itself. We see this very clearly in a famous quote from the Malleus Maleficarum, which was a foundational text of Christian witch hunting written by two German Catholic monks in 1486. The title loosely translates as The Hammer of the Witches, and it was used as a kind of manual in many European witch trials on how to identify a witch and extract a confession. So the quote goes, "All witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable," end quote. The implication here being that witchcraft is a natural expression of women's deviant sexual nature. So whilst a lot of memes nowadays around the witch hunts portray things like, reading as suspicious behavior, the joke being if a woman could read, you burn her at the stake. But what was actually more suspicious and put under the microscope more consistently were women's relationships or lack thereof. The state of being unmarried, whether single or widowed, and childless was incredibly dangerous for adult women in this period and attracted a great deal of scrutiny. There are multiple reasons for this. Firstly, at a more base and worldly level, historians suggest that the politics of envy had something to do with this because, being a single childless woman was highly nonconformist, since the expectation is that more or less all women will wed and bear children. Just think of the 2005 film adaptation of Jane Austen's 19th century novel, Pride and Prejudice, where the character of Charlotte Lucas, who is portrayed as this kind of like frumpy but loyal friend of the female romantic lead Elizabeth Bennet, declared, "I am 27 years old. I have no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents and I'm frightened." Is this the most historically relevant example? No, especially since I don't think this quote is even in the book. I think it was a bit of expositional editorializing by the scriptwriters of the film to make clearer the dynamic between Elizabeth and Charlotte, but I think it's hilarious, so I've included it in this episode, okay? The point is, even as late as the 1800s, which is about 300 years after the period we're referring to, it was considered very weird not to be married with kids. Charlotte's life and single status is portrayed as like a bit of a catastrophe in the book itself. Given the strength of these societal expectations, it's not unexpected that by remaining single and childless during the era of the witch hunts, you risk attracting the ire of your neighbors. This could either just be because, they see you as like a bit of a weirdo and don't trust you, or as was the case with childless widows who often were the sole benefactors of their late husband's property, you had a level of financial independence that was not common for women at the time. At a more mystical level, being a visibly single childless woman raised the prospect that the woman's true lover was Satan. Sounding pretty familiar, right? It's giving a bit of Lilith, isn't it? So, under Christian mythology, female witches were thought to get their powers from sexual communion with a range of mythical creatures, including demons, familiars, and the devil himself. The witch's mark, which was this raised teat allegedly found on the bodies of his servants, was modeled on the female nipple, and indeed, female witches were thought to breastfeed imps from these kind of like mini demons from the teat. The witch's sabbat also, which was a really big part of like French witch lore, was essentially a ceremonial orgy in which women, some queer men, demons, and the devil were all present and all indiscriminately fucking each other. Additionally, contraception at this time, meaning, simply taking steps to ensure that pregnancy did not occur from sexual encounters, was thought to be the work of the devil. Sexual power dynamics were also visibly at play. It bears remembering that all the figures of authority in a witch trial were men, so anyone can make an accusation of witchcraft, but all the judges, peers, torturers, and something called a pricker, who was a guy who looked for the witch's teat by like strip searching and stabbing any raised lumps found on the body to see if they bled, and if they didn't, she was a witch. All of these cunts were men. And I'll quote now from historian Julia M. Garrett, who had this to say. The sexual dimension of witchcraft trials and literature in this view are understood as a conflicted expression of male authority's own sexual longing, which could be conveniently projected onto witch figures ambivalently enjoyed and then ritually purged through the judicial process. So essentially, witch hunts could be understood as a case of pointing with one hand and wanking with the other, the quintessential treatment of the whore in the Madonna-Whore binary, who is both desired and condemned. Who then was the Madonna in the European witch hunts? Well, arguably, if we consider which specific kinds of women were the most persecuted, the Madonna were the middle and upper class women writ large, since it was overwhelmingly working class women who were singled out for this kind of public torture and execution. Professor of political philosophy and prominent second-wave feminist activist Silvia Federici has gone so far as to characterize the witch hunts as an attempt to, quote, criminalize birth control and place the female body, the uterus, at the service of population increase and the production and accumulation of labor power, end quote. In essence, what Federici is referring to is the fact that this particular period in human history was one in which there was an increasing number of peasant revolts, often led by peasant women. These revolts were in response to the seizure of land by the rich, which had previously been held in common, meaning land that peasants could historically make use of, for example, to feed their livestock, was now shut off to them and claimed as private property by the elite classes. This is sometimes referred to as the period of enclosure because it often involved elites literally putting up enclosures or fences around the disputed land. By subordinating working class women to a life of forced reproduction via accusations of witchcraft, which effectively criminalized any attempts to evade reproduction and made women who did not reproduce the source of suspicion, the elite class neutralized their attempts to lead insurrections and obscured the reality of their own land grab through this spectacle of a purge of the whores. At a very similar time to when sexual hierarchies demonizing white working class women were being mobilized by the elites in Western Europe to aid their land grabs, new structures of sexual hierarchy between white and black women were being erected in the slave colonies of the Americas and the Caribbean to protect the material interests of the white slave-owning planter class. So, one thing that it is important to understand is that the status quo within slave plantation societies was predicated on an enormous amount of social control. And this social control was literally enshrined in law. So the slave codes are something I've referenced before in other episodes. For more on them, you can listen back to my episodes on strong women and on the police. But here I want to specifically explore their sexual dimensions. So as a bit of a recap, the slave codes were some of the very first laws passed in the slave colonies of the Caribbean and later the North American colonies that essentially stipulated how slavery operated, who had rights and obligations, and who was excluded. So these laws enshrined three key principles that fundamentally distinguished the enslavement of Africans by Europeans from all kinds of slavery that had come before. They established that slavery would be perpetual, hereditary, and crucially, matrilineal. It was this third stipulation that inserted a distinctly sexual dynamic to the slave codes. The first such slave code was established in 1661 in the British colony of Barbados, but this was taken more or less as a blueprint by the North American slave colonies and also the entire French Caribbean, which passed a similar slave code by royal edict in 1685. It is important to emphasize that making the status of enslavement matrilineal, i.e. hereditary via the line of the mother, was a new invention that was unique to the system of transatlantic African enslavement. Previous models of slavery, such as those which existed in the classical Greek and Roman societies, or even contemporary models of enslavement, such as those which existed for European convict laborers or indentured servants, all designated a specific period of enslavement, and the status did not pass to descendants. The fact that the route to inheriting enslaved status was through the maternal line and not through the paternal line was also particularly important. In practice, this issued a carte blanche to the sexual desires of white men. This was because prior to the passage of the slave codes, sexual relationships between white men and black enslaved women, whether consensual or not, threatened the property rights and colonization efforts of the elites. Essentially, the risk was that these fledgling colonies would run out of land because a flood of illegitimate mixed-race children might try to make claims on this land if they inherited the free status of the father. These slave societies also had far, far more black people living in them than whites, and by the 1700s, many Caribbean colonies were between 70 and 90% black. This demographic fact meant that from day one, there were concerns about where the loyalties of any mixed-race children would fall, basically that they might tip the scales underpinning a quite delicate racial hierarchy. But by enshrining in law the polluting effect of black motherhood, these slave codes ensured that white men of all social classes could do as they wanted with black enslaved women without risking either that the free population would gradually become less white, diluted by an increasing number of free mixed-race offspring, or that the integrity of colonial lands would be threatened by the property claims of these same offspring. In fact, the slaves' codes created a perverse incentive to hypersexualize black women precisely because their offspring would simply add to the human capital of slave societies. So, sexual relationships with black women, again, whether consensual or non-consensual, had a strong economic payoff. And this incentive really peaks in the early 19th century because this is the point that the British Empire abolishes the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. So, this didn't mean that slavery was abolished. It simply meant that no new bodies could be transported for enslavement from the African continent to the New World colonies. Now, these colonies' economies had been almost entirely reliant on enslaved African labor to produce the goods they exported around the world for almost 200 years by this point. The main ones being sugar, cotton, tobacco, indigo, and coffee. So what did these colonists do? Obviously, they don't want to lose money, but slavery had an incredibly high death toll. And without the guarantee of a fresh supply of bodies from the African territories, colonists now had to worry about this much more. So this prompted an increasing concern for the fertility of enslaved African women, and a period which historian Catherine Poe has dubbed the Age of Reproduction. Essentially, the logic went, if we can't buy new slaves, then we will have to breed more slaves here. So, already we can see some similar themes to the circumstances which mobilized the Madonna-Whore binary in the case of the European witch trials, a large underclass of women on whose sexuality the availability of, in this case, free enslaved labor depended. Perhaps predictably then, what we see occurring in the ensuing centuries is the systematic hypersexualization and demonization of black enslaved women as a way to justify their physical and sexual exploitation. In the wake of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade more than ever, the slave code served to denigrate black enslaved women to the status of breeding machines, and a whole swathe of ideology sprung up around this to justify their inhumane treatment. And they did this by portraying black bodies as uniquely sexual, and so uniquely suited to this sexualized role. A lot of this is grounded in another pseudoscientific theory called physiognomy, which really came to the fore in the 19th century and essentially argues that the physical appearance of a person revealed something about their actual character. So, one of my favorite books when I was a teenager, maybe because I was utterly insufferable and had no pals, was Oscar Wilde's novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. So this book is like a pretty harmless example of this kind of thinking. In the book, the protagonist, Dorian Gray, signs a deal with the devil to have all of his sins marked not on his skin, but on the skin of a portrait of him. So by the end of the book, he's done like a bunch of like really debauched shit, and the portrait of him has become like really hideous and deformed, but he himself has remained physically beautiful. At the heart of this book is the assumption that people who have done bad shit will look bad as a result, that our earthly sins are etched on our faces for all to see. This is a clear allusion to the theory of physiognomy, which would have been very popular in Wilde's time. How this played out in the sexualization of black bodies, however, was less harmless than Wilde's bias against, I guess, like, ugly people. It meant that certain physical features, which were in turn characterized to be unique to black bodies, were read as proof of the fundamental difference in the sexual character between black and white people. Specifically, this leads to a white obsession with black genitals, which were alleged to be much larger than those of white people in both the male and female sexes, and were read as a sign of black people's insatiable lust and inherently carnal nature. In the 1800s, during the later era of African enslavement and about 90 years before The Picture of Dorian Gray is published, black bodies thought to exhibit particularly strong examples of these traits were frequently displayed as literal spectacles at so-called freak shows, which were an increasingly popular attraction. The most famous example of this is the black Khoisan woman called Sarah Baartman, who was born in 1790 near the Gamtoos River, now in a region called the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. Now, we know that this was a name given to her by white colonists, but unfortunately her birth name has not been recorded, which in and of itself is revealing of the level of dehumanization that we're dealing with. It is again not clear whether or not Baartman was ever formally enslaved. What is known is that she was allegedly orphaned at a young age and taken to labor on Dutch colonial farms in southern Africa, later working for a spell in Cape Town as a maid and nursemaid, before eventually traveling to London in 1810 to be exhibited in a freak show. An account released shortly after her death by George Cuvier, who we will get to in a fucking minute, described the following. Quote, "An Englishman had led her to believe there was a fortune to be made if she came to offer herself up to the curiosity of the Europeans, but he ended up abandoning her to a Parisian animal trainer in whose household she died of an inflammatory eruptive disease." End quote. Sarah was just 26 years old when she died in 1815, leaving behind 2 children. Accounts on the causes of her death conflict. Some attribute her death to chronic alcoholism. Some have attributed it to pneumonia, which may have in any case been caused by chronic alcoholism, and still others have attributed it to smallpox. Whatever the cause, death did not end her treatment as an object of curiosity, even a literal specimen, since despite having on numerous occasions refused to be examined fully naked by George Cuvier whilst alive, upon her death this same French naturalist, zoologist and pervert took it upon himself to conduct a non-consensual autopsy and subsequently publish a very lengthy report of his so-called findings. In this report, he continuously described her in animalistic terms, repeatedly comparing her to a series of apes in everything from her mannerisms to her physical attributes, and provided graphic detail of every facet of her anatomy, focused particularly on her labia, buttocks, and breasts, all of which he described as abnormally, even freakishly large. His report was influential throughout Europe and the United States, becoming a key text for the growing and extremely racist field of comparative anatomy, and therein contributed to a burgeoning literature focused on the sexual organs and behaviors of black bodies, which served to depict various features of these bodies as repulsive and sexually grotesque. Crucially, at the same time that this freakish, overt sexual nature was being ascribed to black women, the virginal and almost overtly desexualized characteristics of purity, modesty, and delicacy were increasingly being ascribed to white middle-class femininity. If colonial society constructed black enslaved women as licentious whores, then white women, particularly white elite women, were the frigid Madonnas. The journal of Janet Shaw, an upper-middle-class Scottish woman born in Edinburgh who travelled to the slave colonies of Antigua, St. Kitts, and North Carolina as a tourist between the years of 1774 and 1776, provides some revealing examples of this kind of thinking, particularly because she's describing these social systems as a kind of outsider. So Shaw is not from the colonies. She is from the colonizing power, what historians would call the metropolis, and her trip takes place after more than a century into the colonizing efforts in these territories had passed. So there would already have been like a couple of generations of people who were born and raised in the colonies. I say this because, sometimes we tend to misunderstand as modern observers the relationship between the colonial power and the colonial territory. White colonists in these territories occupied this kind of liminal space. They were not truly British. They were not truly of the metropolis, but neither were they truly foreign. So when Shaw is describing the white and black women of the colonies, she's doing it with this kind of like pseudo-anthropological framing. And she's also interestingly addressing her journal as if she were writing it for like a friend back home. Now, we're not sure if there was a real friend that she had in mind or if it's more just like a general friendly audience. Both are possible. We got to remember that this is like before, movies, television, even photographs. So getting together with a friend or group of friends to read your travel journals to each other is not like an inconceivable pastime. Interestingly, Shaw first describes the black women of the island in relation to white men. So she goes on at some length really praising the white men and describing how charming and gentlemanly they are before saying, quote, "I hear you ask me if there is no alloy to this fine character, no reverse to this beautiful picture. Alas, my friend, though children of the sun, they," meaning the white men of the island, "are mortals, and as such they have their share of failings, the most conspicuous of which is the indulgence they give themselves in their licentious and even unnatural amours, which appear too plainly from the crowds of mulattoes." This is a colonial European term to refer to mixed race people, i.e. the offspring of these interracial unions, which you meet in the streets, houses, and indeed everywhere, a crime that seems to have gained sanction from custom, though attended with the greatest inconveniences not only to individuals but to the public in general. The young black wenches lay themselves out for white lovers in which they are all but too successful. End quote. So, I think this is a really revealing description, right? Shaw is here making black women bear the sole responsibility for white men's attraction and for the resulting mixed race offspring, which she in turn characterizes as a public nuisance. It is only the black woman that is the active participant. They are the ones laying themselves out for the white lover. The white men are characterized as almost, disavowing these desires. They don't actively pursue black women, they give in to them. They are characterized as almost helpless in the face of the black seductress. Of black women, Shaw goes on to say, quote, "These wenches become licentious and insolent past all bearing, and as even a mulatto child interrupts their pleasures and is troublesome, they have certain herbs and medicines that free them from such an encumbrance, but which seldom fails to cut short their own lives as well as that of their offspring. By this, many of them perish every year." End quote. So, here Shaw appears to be referring to like herbal birth control practices that many Black women of the island allegedly engaged in. It's very revealing that Shaw characterizes this as being motivated by their own insatiable lust and desire not to be bothered by any resulting offspring, rather than what it probably was, which was a desire not to pass on the status of enslavement to their children, born of unions where even the possibility of consent was dubious. I want to contrast this now with Shaw's portrayal of white women of the island. Of them, she has this to say, quote, "They make excellent wives, fond, attentive mothers, and the best housewives I've ever met with. Those of the first fortune and fashion keep their own keys and look after everything within doors. The domestic economy is left entirely to them. The sun appears to affect the sexes very differently. While the white men are gay, luxurious, and amorous, the women are modest, genteel, reserved, and temperate. This is the last virtue they have indeed to the extreme. This last virtue they have indeed in the extreme. They drink nothing stronger in general than sherbet and never eat about one or two things at a table, and these the lightest and the plainest. The truth is, I can observe no indulgence they allow themselves in, not so much as in scandal, and if I stay long in this country, I will lose the very idea of innocent amusement, for since I resided among them, I've never heard one woman say a wrong thing of another." End quote. So, white women are characterized as the polar opposite of Black women, where Black women are described by Shaw as licentious, insolent wenches. The white women of the island are described as excellent wives, fond, attentive mothers, and modest, genteel, reserved, and temperate. And in fact, they are characterized as so reserved that they're almost boring, with Shaw implying to her reader in an almost like flirtatious way that she will soon miss the mischief of being involved in some scandal and gossip. So why do I bring up this particularly harrowing bit of history? Surely we as a society have moved on a lot since the 18th and 19th centuries and don't tend to think about Black bodies or sex generally in these ways. Yeah, okay, in some ways, right. Yes, we no longer are displaying the genitals of Black people in literal freak shows and openly describing them as licentious wenches. But in some other ways, also wrong. For example, I think anyone who has ever been online or consumed any form of popular media knows the trope about Black genitals being larger than those of other races. It's extremely common even today. All you have to do is search BBC on any given porn site and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And no, sadly, it is not a global thirst for the British Broadcasting Corporation. And whilst the more obviously problematic connotation that these physical differences are a sign Black people are animalistically sexual is not, as explicitly obvious today, I would argue that it is definitely still a powerful, not so subtext of certain common pornographic narratives. Anecdotally, I'm thinking specifically of Blacked, which is an extremely successful interracial pornography channel, perhaps unsurprisingly launched by a white man called Greg Lansky in 2014 as part of his wider porn production empire, Vixen Media Group, which pretty much exclusively makes content depicting white or lighter-skinned women having sex with one or often more darker-skinned Black men, who in turn are performing an animalistic, aggressive, and hyper-masculine expression of sexuality. At a more book-learning level, in 2020, academics Nikki Fritz and others published a content analysis of 1,741 pornographic scenes scraped from the popular porn sites Pornhub and X videos, investigating the depictions of Black men and women in heterosexual pornography. They found that when it came to Black women, they were depicted as the targets of physical aggression in roughly half of all scenes. Aggression here defined as any act likely to cause physical harm, regardless of intent or consent. So it could be things like, consensual choking, spanking, hair pulling, but it could also be depictions of actual sexual violence, mutilation, etc. This was found to be statistically more often than white women who were targets of physical aggression in roughly only a third of all scenes. Similarly, black men were found to display physical aggression in almost half of all scenes, significantly more often than white men, who were found to display physical aggression, again, in just over a third of all scenes. How should we interpret this? Now, I'm not here to police or moralize rough sex between consenting adults. What I am here to talk about is the racialized patterns within depictions of this. To me, the fact that black porn performers are being pigeonholed into these aggressive sexual narratives statistically more often than their white counterparts clearly stems from the legacy of centuries of racist portrayals characterizing black people as having a violently animalistic sexual nature. Even within the context of porn, then, where everybody is, by definition, extremely sexualized, there are still obvious hierarchies of sexualization. There are still groups of women who are treated comparatively gently and women who are singled out for a more punishing form of sexualization. Okay, so now I do want to talk about sex work, and I want to start this section with the topic that will no doubt provoke a collective groan amongst any sex workers listening, and that is Gary Marshall's 1990 Pretty Women. So the plot of this film is not particularly new or original. As Thomas Wartenberg has argued in his book Unlikely Couples, it borrows a lot of narrative tropes from other ugly duckling to beautiful swan style transformation romance stories like George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion or Disney's remake of the classic folktale Cinderella. Essentially, the plot goes: once upon a time, there was a sad little street-based full-service sex worker, Vivian Ward, played by Julia Roberts. Poor little Vivian was struggling to survive, desperately trying to claw her way out of the industry that she'd been pushed into by an abusive boyfriend who left her destitute. Boo! Boo to him! Then, one fateful day, Vivian meets the handsome prince, Edward Lewis, a venture capitalist played by Richard Gere, who has lost his way back to his Castle Reed mansion in Beverly Hills and is haplessly looking for directions on Hollywood Boulevard. The handsome prince sees something special in Vivian and hires her to pretend to be his girlfriend for the entire week. Yes, this is because he can't stand the pretty reasonable demands of his actual girlfriend, who just wants him to spend some time with her and take her seriously as a partner. But no, we are not invited to dwell on that for too long. Over the course of that week, Prince Charming falls in love with Vivian, transforming her from her ugly duckling form, street-based sex worker, into a beautiful swan, rich, waspy lady who can have a passably good time at a polo match. In the end, Vivian supposedly leaves her profession behind to become Edward's full-time girlfriend and, strongly implied, soon-to-be wife. And they all lived happily ever after. So there we go, a fairy tale that is truly fit for the bleak capitalist hellscape of the post-Reagan era. Now, why do I want to start this discussion on sex work with talking about the film Pretty Women? Is it because I am at heart a walking cliche? Yes, okay, probably a bit of that. But also because I do have a point to make here, I swear. I think that this film provides an instructive example of how hierarchies of sexualization exist even within groups of women who are extremely sexualized and who would traditionally always be pigeonholed into the, quote, whore role of the Madonna-Whore binary. And I think that it provides some useful insight into what rationale underpins those hierarchies. So the first place we can start is by asking ourselves why a romantic comedy from 1990, produced by Disney no less, can have a full-service sex worker as the female romantic lead. Why is that okay for what is famously supposed to be a family-friendly media conglomerate? Well, it's because the character of Vivian Ward is portrayed fundamentally as not like the other sex workers. So, near the beginning of the film, when Vivian and Edward are first in his hotel room, Vivian presents Edward with a large selection of condoms to choose from. Such a large selection that he presents this kind of jovial dismay. This establishes Vivian as a conscientious and responsible woman, and Edward's dismay clearly signals to the audience that this is not what we would typically expect of a sex worker that you would find on Hollywood Boulevard, who would apparently have absolutely no regard for their own sexual health because, yeah, like, why the fuck would they care about their own health, I guess. Later on in this scene, Vivian excuses herself to go to the bathroom, but she's gone a suspiciously long amount of time, causing Edward to suspect that she's taking drugs and bust in and confront her, presumably to demand a bump, only to find that she is in fact flossing strawberry seeds out of her teeth. Very demure, very mindful. In yet another scene, Vivian confronts her flatmate Kit about stealing their rent money. When Kit reveals that she has used it to buy drugs, Vivian's obvious disapproval again signals that she is not like Kit, and thus implies that she is not like the community that she surrounds herself with, who are other sex workers. Unlike those other girls, Vivian does not use drugs and she pays her bills. In yet another scene, the advances of Edward's smarmy colleague, Philip Stuckey, played by Jason Alexander, who suggests that he and Vivian must, quote, get together sometime after Edward leaves, end quote, obviously upsets and disgusts Vivian. She seems to be upset because Edward has revealed her secret, and this signals to her that Edward still sees her as nothing more than a sex worker. This emotional reaction is there to convince the audience of Vivian's good and pure heart and of her relative innocence. She's upset precisely because she does not fit the crude caricature of a hardened, cynical streetwalker, a caricature which the film fundamentally does not challenge. So, even though Pretty Woman, as a love story for the masses with a full-service sex worker at its heart, could have revolutionary potential if it actually bothered to challenge any of the dehumanization that sex workers face, it utterly fails to meet that potential because it is so focused on separating Vivian from her peers and portraying her as not really a sex worker. The term whorearchy is one that's been in use since at least the mid-19th century when prolific American diarist George Templeton Strong used it to describe the rapid proliferation of prostitution in lower Manhattan's Five Points neighborhood. Nowadays, though, the term is used more commonly to describe the social hierarchy that exists between different groups of sex workers. In this sense, the modern usage is more about describing stigmatization, with the more stigmatized workers of the industry placed lower down the rung in the hierarchy. In a 2014 article for Jezebel, Bell Knox argued, quote, "The hierarchy is arranged according to intimacy of contact with clients and police," end quote. This means outdoor full-service workers are at the bottom, given that they are both, extremely visible to the police and perform physical sexual acts for their clients. Indoor brothel workers would be, slightly above them, given that they are less visible than street-based workers, but more visible than other kinds of full-service providers, such as escorts, by virtue of generally having a higher volume of clients. Strippers would then be above both brothel workers and sex workers, since they have a lower level of physical intimacy with their clients than all full-service operators. Knox then places sex workers who have no direct contacts with clients or cops at the top of the hierarchy, such as cam girls and phone sex operators. But this list is by no means definitive. Whilst it's generally agreed that street-based full-service workers reside at the bottom as by far the most stigmatized group of sex workers, there's not really massive agreement on which groups reside within the middle and top rungs. If we wanted to be really pretentious, which of course we do, we could reconceptualize the film Pretty Woman as one woman's ascendancy through the hierarchy. Vivian, at the beginning of the film, is the least acceptable, most stigmatized kind of sex worker, a full-service, street-based worker. The initial arrangement she has with Edward, where he hires her for the night in his hotel, would be a more standard escorting out call. This is essentially positioned in the film as a promotion, right? It's obviously more desirable than where Vivian was before, given the change to a luxurious location, provision of expensive food and drink, and the privacy of the indoors. Then, when Edward hires Vivian for the entire week to pretend to be his girlfriend, she is again, in a sense, promoted, this time to the status of quote-unquote high-class escort. This is somebody who takes longer bookings, even week-long bookings, therefore making substantially more money. This is communicated by Vivian's obvious glee at the hefty envelope of cash that she gets, and it's somebody who offers a more traditionally romantic service, i.e., the girlfriend experience. The film positions this kind of sex work as a more prestigious and skilled kind of sex work because, firstly, of the romantic element, which seems to blur the lines between conventional sex work and dating, but secondly, also because it is suggested that it takes a certain kind of character and education to seamlessly blend in with the social status of these wealthy clients. High-class escorts are then implicitly positioned as more worthy than other kinds of sex workers precisely because they are supposedly more refined. As film theorist Thomas Wartenberg again suggested in his book Unlikely Couples, Vivian is clearly positioned as rightfully belonging at least amongst this rung society through several makeover and outfit change montages in the film, which use various cinematic devices such as, slow panning shots and changes to the lighting and musical score to suggest that her natural beauty truly shines through when she is decked out in all the accoutrements of the upper classes. The story that Disney is trying to tell here about female sexuality is one in which the transparent, open, and perhaps even cynical exchange of sex for money is morally unacceptable, personally undesirable, and will lead to a life of unhappiness. In Disney's world, it is only acceptable to materially benefit from sex if that sex is wrapped up in the package of romantic love. It's okay to enrich yourself through sex as long as this enrichment is coincidental and not your primary motivation. Vivian is worthy of riches precisely because she does not actively seek them beyond just wanting to get enough money to leave sex work forever. This is the liminal space in which the most socially acceptable forms of full-service sex work have operated for centuries, one where you sell the illusion that you are not actually a sex worker. For example, the meteoric rise of so-called sugar dating in recent years, where young, beautiful women seek, quote, relationships with older, wealthy men, has been facilitated in large part by its success in selling this myth, to the extent that this is by some people not even considered a form of sex work. Sugar Baby and author of memoir Dear Mr. Andrews, Lottie Latham, observes that this myth is basically a marketing ploy to soothe the ego of predominantly male clients. Quote, "The stigma of being a John doesn't really get talked about as much as the stigma of being a sex worker, but the idea of being a John is seen as desperate, and they like to think of themselves as people that can get access to young, hot pussy because of their wealth and status. It's an ego-affirming thing. The fantasy is that it's old-fashioned chivalry. They don't want you to be a sex worker, they just want to pay you for sex." End quote. This reveals something fundamental about the Madonna-Whore binary. It's not just the sexualization which distinguishes the whore from the Madonna. It's also about intent. The whore is not just a whore because she is sexual. She is a whore because she chooses to be sexual. The responsibility and thus the blame for her sexuality starts and ends with her. We saw this first way back when with the mythology surrounding Eve and Lilith. Whilst both are fallen women, literally fallen from the Garden of Eden as a result of their lust, Eve is portrayed mainly as a kind of weak, deserving of pity sort of woman. She's tricked by the snake, and it's fundamentally her naivety that leads to her downfall, not her malice. Lilith, on the other hand, actively chooses her own fate. She chooses to leave Adam, and in this sense, chooses a life of evil. We also saw this very clearly with Janet Shaw's extremely racist descriptions of black enslaved women in the Caribbean colonies during the 18th century, who she characterized as wenches that, quote, laid themselves out. Notice the active voice for white lovers. Here, passive voice is used. The lovers are anonymous. Similarly, the fundamental difference between the sugar baby and the street-based full-service sex worker is not the kind of service that they are providing. Let's be very clear. Both are providing sex in exchange for material goods. The difference is that the sugar baby has plausible deniability that this is her sole or even primary motivation. It's not that she wants money, it's that she enjoys being spoiled. It's not that she needs a regular income to survive, it's that she'd love an allowance so she can focus on her studies or deepen her art practice, or maybe even so she can spend more time looking after herself for you. In this sense, the hierarchy is not just about what kind of sex work is physically closest to police and clients, but I would argue, particularly when we're looking within the pool of different types of full service providers, it is also about which kinds of sex work is most obviously motivated by money. The shorter the appointment, the higher volume of clients, the more regular the payments, the more obvious that this is motivated by money. Following this logic, some commentators have characterized relationships and marriage with a wealthy man as the most socially acceptable kind of sex work, meaning we could really view Vivian's decision to leave the profession to be with Edward as just another promotion, this time to the status of wife. For example, author and self-described semi-retired call girl Maggie McNeil had this to say of the relationship between marriage and sex work. Quote, "When a whore sees a client, what she is essentially contracting is a very short-term surrogate marriage. She gives him a little of what a wife gives a husband, sex and/or companionship, and he gives her a little of what a husband gives a wife, financial support. The exact arrangement, man contributes support, women contribute sex and/or companionship, is completely legal in the long-term form we call marriage, but illegal in the temporary form we call prostitution. Now, don't start screaming that marriage is different because it involves love. Where is it written that a couple have to love each other in order to make marriage legal?" End quote. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure how seriously to take this position. There's a chance she's being like a bit of an edgelord to make a point about like how hypocritical and puritanical the criminalization of full service sex work is. But just in case she's not, obviously what's wrong with her viewpoint is that it's premised in this like very myopic kind of gender essentialism where it is exclusively men that are economic providers who crave sex and exclusively women who are consumers and gatekeep its access. This belies the not insignificant industry of male full-service sex workers who cater to female clients, as well as basically the entire possibility that women can also be motivated by sex when looking for a partner. But Maggie would not be alone in holding such a viewpoint on the nature of relationships between men and women. In a perhaps ironic, but maybe not entirely coincidental twist, her views on the natural ordering of a marriage quite strongly echo those made on certain segments of the political right. So, this is the part of the show where I drive myself completely insane by exploring the world of internet discourse on gender and feminism. Famously, only good things are said about women here, so that's great. Because now we're going to talk about the trad wife. So, what's a trad wife? Well, it's a portmanteau that very cleverly and uniquely combines the term traditional and wife to signal that these are women who are choosing to prioritize supposedly traditional ideals of femininity and marriage in their lives, usually adding a strong dash of conservative Christianity to their worldview. So these are women who really believe in and advocate for the institution of marriage. They choose to get married and typically like at a very young age. They choose to have lots of children and generally, although we'll get to that in a minute, choose to not have professional careers outside of the home and instead focus their work on homemaking. For some reason, these choices also require that they embrace a specific aesthetic. The acceptable flavors are either that of a 1950s housewife, so lots of skirt dresses, big structured busts, we'll get to that in a minute as well, or the crunchy granola flavor of floaty dresses and barefooted nature goddesses. It also seems to involve making a lot of things from scratch. I guess because you have all this time since you're not like going out to work. So there is this kind of like undercurrent of tradwifery, of rejecting fast consumer culture of today. So like no fast food, no fast fashion, you're mending clothes yourself, you're making elaborate meals every day for your family, again, from scratch. One particularly viral tradwife influencer and professional model, Nara Smith, has taken this making things from scratch shtick to such an extreme that she's become like a meme. So back in May 2024, Smith's sister was visiting and apparently had this like craving for bubblegum, and instead of just going to the shop and buying some like some kind of ungodly harlot, Nara gracefully floats into the kitchen in a full beat, obviously, and very casually whips up some candy floss flavored bubblegum from scratch. My favorite one, though, is where she makes a whole cigarette from scratch. Like, no, I'm just kidding. That was the meme version, but I think that's infinitely more useful than making fucking bubble gum. Let's all just grow up and give the people what they want, which is 1 million cigarettes. And actually, that's another point, right? If we're going to take things back to the 1950s, can we at least bring back the free-flowing Valium and cigarettes? Like, what the fuck? I mean, come on, guys. We picked the worst of all the bits. So anyway, those minor suggestions aside, the trad wife thing is essentially an internet phenomenon that more or less responds to a perceived decline in the value of the nuclear family, with less and less people prioritizing having kids and the general cultural discourse not being like super welcoming to kids, as well as a perceived lack of consideration for women's sex-based differences in experience within progressive discourses. So there's this notion that progressive politics tries to like flatten the difference between men and women and proclaim that we're all the same. And trad wives like don't want that to be the case. You know, they want women to they don't want essentially women to be made into men. They still want women to be women. They want to be like traditionally feminine. They want to do traditionally feminine things. And crucially, and this is probably like the main selling point for a lot of women at least, they want to not have to do all of the traditionally masculine things that men do. And you know what, like I totally hear that, right? So the other day I was at my friend's house and my boyfriend, who's this like very traditionally like masculine guy, was helping her hang up some artwork around her apartment that she'd had like sitting around for a year because, you know, since her separation from her husband, she got it into her head that she wouldn't be able to hang up a painting correctly without male assistance. And I think this is insane and that she grossly underestimated herself, but it was this like very moving experience and we all loved it. You know, literally me and all the gals were just like following him around the flat, watching him put up all this artwork and just like enjoying the experience of having a manly man do manly things for us, the girls, around the house. Where the trad wifery gets more contentious, though, is their categorization of things like being in paid employment as a traditionally manly thing. So in the trad wife worldview, it is the husband that goes out and earns the money for the family, and it's the wife's job to ensure that he comes home to a happy, healthy, and crucially, beautiful home. So in her 2023 viral video, How to Become a Trad Wife, 25-year-old trad wife influencer Estee Williams advises viewers to, quote, number 1, embrace ultra-traditional gender roles into your marriage. The man, he is the provider, the main breadwinner. He goes out of the house and works. The woman, the wife, she is the homemaker. She takes care of the home. She takes care of herself. And she does the cooking and the cleaning. She then goes on to advise in a segment which really does say the quiet part out loud. Quote, number 5, and I mean this in the best possible way, upkeep your beauty maintenance. Men, husbands, they're very visual. I'm not saying put on a full face of makeup every day, but I do mean pull yourself together. Make sure you look presentable, whatever that may mean for you. For me, full face of makeup. I love house dresses, and that's just me. But make sure you are keeping up with your beauty and yourself. You are fit, you are healthy, because you and your husband will benefit from this. End quote. So, much to unpack here. Now, to be clear, like I do not have an inherent issue with the concept of like trying to look nice for your partner. You know, being physically attracted to each other is a really, really important part of a romantic relationship. It's a really important part of your sexual connection, and especially in long-term relationships, that aspect can require a bit of tending, a bit of work, a bit of maintenance, right? All okay. What I do think is kind of revealing here, though, is that there's not really like equivalent content advising men on how to be traditional husbands, certainly not to this scale or popularity. And the stuff that does exist doesn't have any mention of like staying hot as one of the prerequisites of being a good husband. Now, I want to again caveat that by saying there is like a massive and growing emphasis within content geared at men about the importance of, quote, like getting into shape, being ripped, etc. But this content is much less about, you know, finding and keeping a single partner, much less about, you know, earning their love than it is about being desirable in general and signaling your status as a man primarily to other men through this desirability. In fact, one of the key promises made by a lot of these manosphere-style influencers is that it will help you get a lot of women. Women are then positioned as these kind of collectible objects that en masse signify your worth as a man to other men. Having women desire you is about showing that you are the alpha. They are desirable primarily because of what they say about your status in society. The importance of physical appearance is then positioned very differently within this tradwife context, because that then is about, earning a single man's love and approval. And now we get to the key question, because who exactly is this content for, right? Why is it so important that the wives are like, perfect domestic goddesses who are crucially hot, but apparently there's like no requirements for the man beyond paying for stuff? Even though this content is ostensibly marketed towards young women, the extent to which those ideas are actually popular amongst young women is debatable at best. For example, in the latest edition of the British Social Attitude Survey, which is a large-scale nationwide household survey conducted by the National Institute of Social Research, so like really good quality stats, when in 2022, they asked whether respondents agreed or disagreed with the statement, "A job is all right, but what most women really want is a home and children." 11% of women agreed with that statement, and actually only 12% of men agreed with that statement. So this is a significant decline from 1989, when almost a third of people agreed that women would want to be a caregiver more than an employee, with 35% of men and 28% of women agreeing with that statement back in the 80s. So not only is there this like steep decline in overall agreement with this central tenet of the tradwife worldview, i.e. that a woman's rightful place is in the home, but also the difference between men and women's views on this is narrowing. Even further, whilst in 1987, 48% of people in the UK agreed with the statement, "A man's job is to earn the money, a woman's job is to look after the home and the family," by 2022, only 9% of people agreed with that statement. Clearly then, tradwife ideology does not enjoy mass appeal amongst either women or men. So who is it for? Well, a study conducted by journalism watchdog Media Matters in 2024 tracked the recommendations generated on TikTok's For You page after engaging exclusively with tradwife content. They found that 30% of the videos recommended after watching the content contained, quote, "conspiracy theories and apocalyptic fear-mongering," end quote, particularly around the need to prepare for an impending civil war, and also contained other common far-right talking points such as medical disinformation and anti-government rhetoric. Why is this important? So a lot of tradwives try to dance around this question of political ideology. They generally don't overtly identify themselves as right-wing influencers. In fact, they will often skirt past this issue by dressing up their lifestyle in the language of choice feminism, essentially saying, this is empowering for me as a woman because I get to make the choice to submit to my husband, I choose to leave the rat race. I choose to prioritize my children. I choose to focus on homemaking. But when we look at the algorithmically generated recommendations of social media platforms like TikTok, which are all driven by the same singular logic of what is most likely to get you to stay on this platform based off of either, things that you've chosen to stay for before or various bits of your personal data that we hold, what kind of content do we think you as a viewer are most susceptible to engaging with? When we look at those recommendations generated by these algorithms for users that have viewed or otherwise engaged with tradwife content, we see that a large bulk of those recommendations are extremely right-wing. We can see that tradwife content is firmly placed within the ecosphere of the alt-right, whether they want to admit it or not. And we can also see that because the alt-right loves to talk about tradwives. So one of the videos I watched to research this section was a video on Ben Shapiro's YouTube. So Ben Shapiro, by the way, for those who remain blissfully unaware, is a conservative media pundit and co-founder of the extremely right-wing Daily Wire platform. Nowadays, Ben focuses a lot of his commentary on popular culture, but he originally rose to prominence by quote-unquote destroying young left-wing students in public debates, avoiding debates with experienced interlocutors after an incredibly embarrassing showing with Andrew Neil. During a Twitter rant about Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion's 2020 smash hit WAP, he inexplicably self-reported never once making his wife wet. So it's great to see that Ben is chiming in on how to keep a marriage going. Anyway, the video is about 10 minutes long and consists of Ben reacting to various TikToks about trad wives. But the introduction features this truly bizarre opening where Ben overlays the scene from the end of the Christian Bale movie Batman: The Dark Knight, where Lieutenant Jim Gordon is giving a speech about how, Gotham didn't get the hero that they wanted, but the hero that they needed, a knight shining in the dark, etc., etc. And he superimposes this image of a 1950s trad wife over the place where Harvey Dent's face appears behind the podium in the movie. It's just this unearthly level of cringe, but clearly communicates this idealized position that trad wives hold within certain right-wing circles, because that's where the trad wives actually hold most appeal, right? So we could say that the trad wife is a sexual fantasy created for men. Some people have indeed said that. And yes, the focus trad wife influencers place on maintaining this very specific standard of feminine beauty does suggest that this is something that caters to the male gaze. But let's give the boys credit where it's due. At least of the men that I know, I don't really think there's a single one of them who truly wants to go out and be the sole breadwinner and not really spend any time with their kids or their family and basically just come home for meals. Admittedly, I do think that a hot woman serving the meals would soften the blow, but I still don't think this would be an ideal, especially since a lot of them don't even want to have kids these days. So why? Why would they do this? All of this to say, this isn't a universal male fantasy, right? This is a fantasy for a niche subpopulation of right-wing men, and arguably also for women who view women in this very specific kind of way. And this leads me to my final thesis statement of this episode. The trad wife is the sexualized Madonna. She is the latest attempt to try and resolve what Freud called psychic impotence, which was the sexual dysfunction experienced by men who suffered from the Madonna-Whore complex and so could not integrate their feelings of love and lust without challenging the worldview that underpins it. So in that worldview, women are seen as either purely sexual objects, i.e. whores worthy of denigration, or desexualized, saintly, mother-like figures, i.e. the Madonna. Now, generally on the right, this binary view of women as either Madonnas or whores is very much alive and well. We can see this perhaps most obviously in the puritanical obsession with, body counts, which supposedly reveals something fundamental about your value as a woman, and all the discourse around women with apparently high body counts being used up old hags and roasties, which, by the way, is an incel term for what they think a woman's labia looks like when she's had a lot of male sexual partners, which they liken to a roast beef sandwich. Yes, it was not fun to research this episode. So if you would like to contribute to my Smash Room fund, then please consider supporting us on Patreon. Anyway, on the right, the traits that are upheld as desirable for women to be if they are to be, a good girl, wifey material, a high value woman, etc. Essentially, if they want to be picked, right? These are traits that are actually traits that emphasize physical and sexual modesty. For example, when pornographer and alleged sex trafficker Andrew Tate was asked what kind of traits he would look for in a woman, he had this profoundly insecure series of words to say, quote, Let's say I'm dating a new girl and I walk into a high-end restaurant and some guy or some girl walks up and is like, oh, hi. And she's like, oh, hi, da-da-da. Instant red flag. Why do you know this bitch in this restaurant? How many times you been in this restaurant? Who's that bitch? Who's this dude? Oh, he's my friend. He's a promoter. Red flag. There's no such thing as male friends. That's fucking bullshit. Women don't actually realize what men find attractive, because if you did, you'd all act completely different. You ain't got no clue. So if you go like girls dancing in the club, no, stand the fuck still. Don't do that. Don't do that. I don't want to see that. Dancing in the club, people knowing who she is, being busy. I don't trust them busy bitches. Through experience, they all add up to the same thing. There's no such thing as a girl who goes into high-end restaurants who everybody knows, who's busy all the time, who ain't jumping on some dick. I don't want it. So me, personally, something that would set a girl apart would be a beautiful, kind, courteous woman who really doesn't know many people, really doesn't do very much, extremely small circle, who is honest and open about the fact that she's dating somebody. I've been around the block and I've met beautiful women. And when I say beautiful women, I mean 15 out of 10. Private Instas, no profile. Why don't you have a profile? Because I don't want guys to follow me. That's the kind of shit I like. End quote. Tate is very open about wanting a woman that's beautiful and desirable, but only for him. He doesn't want her beauty and desirability to be a public spectacle. He essentially wants a woman who is completely uninterested in their own beauty and desirability. This goes back to the whole intent dimension of the Madonna-Whore binary. Remember that what positions you in the binary as a whore is not your sexual appeal, but how intentionally you use your sexual appeal. Much like the most successful and socially acceptable kind of sex workers trade in the illusion that they're not really selling sex, women who enjoy prestige and adoration by right-wing men do so by being a sex icon that sells the illusion that they're not really a sex icon. They carefully tread the line between the Madonna and the whore, pushing the boundary just enough to build their sexual cachet, but not so much that they expose the fact they're actually aware of their sexual cachet. And they do this because whilst we all know that within patriarchal societies, an overtly sexualized women is the source of a lot of stigma and criticism, the whore in the Madonna-Whore binary serves as a cautionary tale to women here. What we also know, but acknowledge much less often, is that a truly desexualized woman is powerless. Let's consider for a moment the societal treatment of women approaching middle age. So women have often commented that they started to feel invisible in society as they approached the ages of 40 or 50, leading them to be, passed over in the workplace, literally ignored in conversation, no longer seeing themselves as represented in the media, etc. This is so common, in fact, that it has come to be known as the invisible women syndrome. In a heartwarmingly detached and academic explanation of this phenomenon, Helen Foster speculates that this may happen because youth is a measure of female fertility, and this, quote, was traditionally the primary function of females in a patriarchal society. So, quote, women who could no longer reproduce were thought to have lost their value and could be easily marginalized or discarded, end quote. Whereas, quote, fertility was never the primary measure of value for men, end quote. If we wanted to lower the tone a bit and explain this phenomenon in a less heartwarmingly detached and academic fashion, we could rephrase it as, once you are no longer of what society deems to be a fuckable age, you are worthless and we will not even acknowledge your existence. I do want to caveat, though, by saying that a lot of older women find ways to make this newfound invisibility empowering. In an article for The Guardian, for example, Deborah Wood details how she used her middle age as an opportunity to engage in illegal street art since nobody paid enough attention to her to notice that she was breaking the law. So I guess there are some wins still to be had. Maybe they're not all crime based. But anyway, overall, I would say that it's fairly obvious that women are disempowered by their loss of sex appeal. Another area that we can see this dynamic at play is also in the seemingly inevitable good girl gone bad phase that female child stars have to go through in order to maintain cultural relevance. Think Miley, Britney, Ariana, Christina. So, obviously, as children, all these women had to be at least ostensibly desexualized. There's probably a whole other episode in that, the at times not even so borderline pedophilic gaze through which female child stars were portrayed in the early 2000s, but maybe that's one for another day. But at some point, basically, once they'd reached sexual maturity and could expand their audiences beyond just other children, all of these stars went through a period of performing this, overtly rebellious, sexualized expression of femininity. Think Britney's I'm a Slave for You era, Christina's Dirty era, Miley and Ariana's well-documented forays into Black culture. And they all did this in order to break away from the virginal, pure, but ultimately anemic form of femininity that they performed in their youth, because that shit has a shelf life. Society claims to want girls to be these pure virginal Madonnas, but the reality is, and not to sound too much like some sort of cynical cigar-smoking, whiskey-chugging media executive, but the reality is that sex sells. And if you want to stay relevant, you can't play the Madonna forever. Now, there has been a lot of speculation over what motivates these tradwife influencers. There is what I would call a little bit of social hysteria going around about them on the left, with a lot of people portraying them as the harbingers of the downfall of feminism, like the first step on the inevitable track that leads to a society that looks like something out of a Margaret Atwood novel. And there probably is some of that, right? There probably are some trad wives out there who are fully drinking the Kool-Aid and genuinely want to create a society where a woman's place is highly codified and confined to the home in this very Mormonistic way. But I would hazard a guess that those are not the trad wives that we see on social media. And the reason that it's not those women is because we see them on social media, right? Now, this is not a new point. This is something that a lot of people have observed, but there is an inherent hypocrisy in these women marketing a lifestyle that promises to remove women from the workforce whilst themselves actively participating in the workforce. Because being an influencer is a job. You are essentially a micro-marketing firm, a one-woman advertising agency. And this is why I think when we talk about trad wives, we need to not just talk about the things that they say, because they don't even fully buy into the things that they say. We need to talk about their motivations for saying these things. Now, I'm inclined to side more with the social media journalist Max Reed, who positions the tradwife as essentially the latest in a series of female grifts, or what he calls audience strategies that will culminate in a handful of successful female tradwife influencers at the top and a simping army of male fans holding them up at the bottom, following, according to Max, in the footsteps of the e-girl and the OnlyFans content creator. Because if we're really fucking being for real here, do we honestly think that any of these women would be saying any of these things on the platforms that they're saying them if there wasn't some kind of social reward for doing so? And I mean, this is a very simplistic take, but why do people do anything on social media? Because they think it will benefit them in some way. So these women, either consciously or unconsciously, understand that there is social cachet to be won amongst predominantly right-wing men and the women who want to appeal to them by performing this kind of femininity. Ultimately, though, and not to sound too much like some sort of bitter spinster that I have no doubt that some people will want to make me out as, I think a lot of these women are going to end up finding that the berry is not worth the squeeze. Consider now the case of Lauren Southern, former darling of the alt-right who rose to international notoriety in the 2010s for her controversial views on Islam, immigration, and liberal feminism. These views, in fact, were so controversial that she was banned from traveling to the UK on the basis of distributing what the UK government classed as, quote, racist material on flyers surrounding a restaurant in Luton. So these flyers said, quote, Allah is a gay god. Southern defended the flyers at the time, saying that it was a, quote, social experiment. In 2019, though, Southern, who at the time had over 500,000 YouTube subscribers, suddenly left the spotlight to pursue a more traditional feminine life rooted in marriage and motherhood, i.e., to become a trad wife. Cut to 4 years later, though, and Southern is back, following a divorce from her allegedly psychologically abusive husband. She made a now unlisted long-form YouTube video titled The Last 5 Years in September 2023, describing his mounting resentment towards her, his weeks-long reminders of what a burden she was to his life and career, his constant threats of divorce, his insistence that she leave social media and physically move across the world from her support networks, and his frequent disappearances for days at a time whenever Lauren displeased him, often locking her and their infant son out of the house. But this time she's back not only as an outspoken critic of the toxicity of trad life, but also as a self-described organizer of a so-called Underground Railroad for women in the conservative movement. The Underground Railroad being, of course, a resistance network that existed in the United States during the era of slavery and worked from the 18th century up to the Civil War to try and help enslaved people escape to freedom. Pretty big U-turn there from Lauren, I would say. So how have Lauren's besties on the alt-right responded to this, you may ask? Well, perhaps predictably, it's with a lot of vitriol. For example, George W. Miller, known by his pseudonym Rollo Tomasi, host of the Rational Male podcast. No, I am not kidding, that is the title. And a man who Wikipedia describes as the godfather of the manosphere, in a 4.5-hour-long deep dive into Lauren's divorce, speculated that her marriage fell apart because she allegedly has borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, ADHD, and is probably, quote, on the spectrum, is, quote, attention-seeking, and has, quote, pretty much linked up with any guy who is hot enough to fool around with, but also could advance your career, end quote. In addition to portraying Lauren as essentially a mentally unstable harlot who cynically uses her sexuality to advance her professional goals, he also generally accuses her of having a victim mentality and presenting a misleading account of the breakdown of her marriage, consistently positioning her husband's decision to leave her and their infant son via text as firmly her fault. What can we learn from the tale of Lauren Southern? Well, I think the most important lesson is that there is no winning for women within a worldview that operates to categorize them into Madonnas and whores. And I want to be really clear that this is not just a problem for the right. There are men and women across the political spectrum who hold some form of this worldview. What I would say, though, is that the communication of incentives to participate in a misogynistic worldview is much more explicit on the right. There is much clearer and open signaling that women who promise to perform a compliant, submissive, and feminine ideal will be rewarded with the status of wifey, mother, good girl, etc., whilst the rest will be labeled as bitches, whores, washed up, ran through, or whatever other misogynistic trope they want to throw at you. I've thought about this a lot because when I was like 13, 14, just starting high school, and I totally went through this pick me phase, very much bought into the idea that if I positioned myself as not like the other girls and participated in the sorts of ritual misogyny and slut shaming that seemed to plague every high school, then I would be spared. Spoiler, I absolutely was not, and many misogynistic rumors were spread about me at school. all of which were kind of like laughably untrue, maybe one for another day. And when I reflect on the experience now, it really drives home that even if you've ostensibly won, even if you're like today the saintly Madonna, the wifey, the good girl, or even just like one of the guys, even if you've done all of that shit, you have never actually vanquished the possibility that you will be cast down as the whore. Because in the Madonna-Whore worldview, somebody has to be the whore. She has to exist to hold up this binary thinking. She has to remain there as this perpetual warning to all women not to step out of line. So what you're doing when you're buying into that vision of the world as a woman is that you're kind of agreeing to sign yourself up for life, to have every single aspect of your behavior be the source of your possible downfall. And even when you have supposedly followed the rules, you could still, even then, be labeled as the whore for literally no reason. So consider, for example, now, Joe Rogan's take on Jeff Bezos' divorce. Now, as a reminder, Jeff Bezos is the billionaire founder of Amazon and at the time of writing, one of the richest men on the planet. In 2019, following revelations that Bezos had been unfaithful to his wife in their 25-year marriage in what ended up to be like a highly publicized affair with a woman called Lauren Sanchez, Bezos' wife, Mackenzie Scott, files for and is granted a divorce. In the divorce settlement, Scott was granted 25% of Bezos's 16% stake in Amazon, so 4% overall, right? And the total settlement awarded to Scott was worth like $38 billion. Now, it's important to note that in Washington state, where the couple actually lived, Scott should be entitled to a clean 50% split of any assets accumulated during the marriage, which did include Bezos' stake in Amazon. Since they were married in 1993, Jeff didn't start the company until 1994. Additionally, Scott not only took significant career breaks to raise and homeschool their 4 children, she also, according to a New York Times profile, was integral in setting up Amazon, contributing to its business plan, working as its first accountant, and even shipping its first orders. So, we would assume if right-wing men were going to be consistent in the application of their worldview towards women, that Mackenzie hasn't really done anything wrong here, you know? She's ostensibly been an exemplary wife and mother. She's made significant sacrifices in her own life and ambitions to support those of her husband, and still, regrettably, he was unfaithful. Surely, they would agree she's entitled to have. Obviously, no. On episode 1222 of the Joe Rogan Experience, after audibly and theatrically gasping at the information that your spouse is entitled to half of all assets accumulated during the marriage under both Washington and Californian law, Rogan goes on to say, quote, "Oh, they better stay friends. She," meaning Mackenzie Scott, "should be super nice to him, even if he only gives her a quarter, even if she's like, I was wronged, end quote. The implication being that Scott should be grateful even if she only gets half of what she is legally entitled to. Then, in July 2021, after referring to Lauren Sanchez, Bezos' mistress during his marriage with Mackenzie Scott, as a, quote, alpha predator female, and fervently agreeing with his guest Yanis Pappas' statement that the, quote, puss must be insane, Rogan goes on to say, quote, if you think about successful, now I'm not saying that every woman that got divorced from her husband and made a shit ton of money is a gold digger, but literally most millionaires and billionaires that are females are from divorce, end quote. He bases this assertion on literally nothing. So, to summarize, from his own words, Rogan thinks that the main way that women get rich is through divorce, but he simultaneously thinks that women divorcing rich men should be grateful for whatever they can get, even if that is less than what they are legally entitled to. Now, to the gals listening, I hope it goes without saying, but the men who hold these kinds of views will never truly respect you. You can try and mold yourself into a more acceptable kind of woman, into a perfect little Madonna, but that shit is hard and it is also tiring. And even if you do everything right, there is no guarantee that they won't arbitrarily change the rules of the game. The only way to actually win is obviously to tear up that rule book. And that's it from me today, folks. Fucking hell, it's been a long one. Thanks so much to all of you for joining me. Remember, you can listen back to any and all of my episodes on all major podcasting platforms and also on YouTube. I hope you like the show. If you really like the show, please consider supporting us with money, especially if I'm venturing more into the realm of like internet commentary. The Wine and Vapes Fund will need to increase exponentially for like my health. All right. And on that note, be good to each other, guys. Catch you next time. Bye.